am that I am. God's eternal power versus today's struggles for justice. Who is God? It's a question that has echoed through history, stirring hearts and minds across generations. Philosophers have debated it, theologians have studied it, and seekers of truth have wrestled with it. But long before human inquiry, before the rise and fall of empires, before even the first written word, this question had an answer. In the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 14, we witness a moment that forever changed human understanding of the divine. Moses, a man once a prince of Egypt but now a shepherd in the wilderness, stands before a burning bush that is not consumed. It is here, in this sacred and mysterious encounter, that God reveals his name. I am that I am. What does this mean? How can a phrase so simple carry such weight? These words, though brief, hold an ocean of meaning. They reveal a God who is not bound by time, not shaped by human hands, and not subject to change. A God who simply is, eternal, self-existent, unshaken by the forces that move the world. And yet, this question, who is God, remains as relevant today as it was in Moses' time. People still seek certainty in an uncertain world. They long for something unchanging, something that offers true security and purpose. Take, for example, the protests against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. These protests are not just about land or policy. They are about something deeper: justice, authority, and the role of faith in confronting the powers of this world. Just as Moses stood before Pharaoh, calling for the release of the oppressed, modern voices are rising against institutions that seem immovable. It raises a crucial question. Where do we place our trust? Is it in human systems, governments, corporations, and laws? Or is it in something higher, something eternal? As we explore I am that I am, we will uncover not just a name, but a truth that has the power to transform our understanding of God, the world, and even ourselves. If you believe these conversations about faith and truth matter, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these messages to more people searching for hope and clarity in today's world. Now, let's dive in. The meaning of I am that I am. When Moses stood before the burning bush, he encountered a reality beyond human comprehension. A voice from within the flames declared, I am that I am. These words were not just an introduction. They were a revelation of God's nature, a declaration of his absolute independence and eternal existence. Unlike everything else in creation, God does not rely on anything or anyone to exist. He is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. He is not bound by time, nor is he subject to change. While the world around us shifts and crumbles, he remains constant. This is not just a theological concept, it's a profound source of peace. In a world filled with uncertainty, where people are let down by governments, institutions, and even their own expectations, the knowledge that God is unshaken offers true security. And yet, for all his infinite power, God chooses to be near us. He is not a distant, indifferent force, but an intimate presence, guiding and sustaining his people. The very name I am tells us that he is always present, always active, always enough. This idea resonates beyond biblical history. It speaks directly to the struggles we see today. Consider the ongoing protests against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. These protesters stand against powerful institutions, uncertain of the outcome, but convinced they are fighting for something greater than themselves: justice, stewardship of creation, and the right to be heard. Like Moses, they face opposition, yet they persist because they believe in something higher. When we understand I am that I am, we realize that our trust should not be in shifting human systems, but in the one who never changes. It challenges us to ask, where do we place our faith? In fleeting power or in the eternal God? A message for those feeling lost. Have you ever felt like you were drifting, unsure of your purpose, uncertain of where life is leading you? It's a feeling that can weigh heavy on the heart. The world moves so fast, and yet, in the midst of it all, many of us struggle to find real direction. But what if I told you that understanding I am could bring clarity and peace, even in the most uncertain moments of life? Moses understood what it meant to feel lost. He had once lived as a prince of Egypt only to find himself in exile, tending sheep in the wilderness. He had no title, no clear future, and no idea that God was about to call him into one of the most extraordinary missions in human history. When Moses approached the burning bush, he wasn't just encountering a miraculous sight. He was stepping into the presence of the eternal God. And when he asked for a name, a way to comprehend the one who spoke to him, God simply declared, "I am that I am." These words were more than a title. They were a declaration of God's self-existence, unchanging nature, and absolute sufficiency. Unlike the gods of Egypt, deities dependent on myths and human imagination, the God of Israel needed no validation, no origin story, no dependency. He simply is. And that truth changed everything for Moses. But what about us? How does this revelation impact those who feel unheard, unseen, or struggling to find purpose? Consider the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP protests happening today. These are not just political battles. They are struggles of conviction. Protesters are standing against powerful institutions, believing they are called to defend the land, uphold justice, and protect communities from harm. Many of them feel small in the face of opposition. Much like Moses before Pharaoh, they wonder if their voices matter, if their actions will make a difference. And yet, just as God was with Moses, He is still with those who stand for what is right. When we feel lost, uncertain, or overwhelmed by the world's injustices, we can trust in the unchanging I am. He is the constant in an ever-shifting world. He is the guide when we feel directionless. He is the foundation when everything else feels unstable. The same God who called Moses calls us today to trust Him, to walk boldly in faith, and to remember that even when we feel like we are drifting, He is always present, always faithful, and always enough. Moses and the burning bush. A life-changing encounter. Moses never expected his life to change in an instant. He had spent years in the wilderness, far from the power and privilege he once knew in Egypt. But on an ordinary day, as he led his flock through the rugged terrain, something extraordinary caught his eye. A bush engulfed in flames, yet not consumed. As he drew closer, a voice called out, "Moses! Moses!" It was the voice of God. The ground beneath him was suddenly holy. He removed his sandals, trembling as he stood before the divine. Then came the revelation that would alter the course of history. God declared, "I am that I am." No elaborate explanation, no grand title, just a declaration of existence, eternal, unchanging, self-sufficient. For Moses, this was more than just a name. It was a challenge to shift his perspective, to trust in a power greater than himself. He had been called to confront Pharaoh, the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, and demand freedom for an enslaved people. He felt unworthy, incapable, overwhelmed. But God's response was clear. "I am with you." This moment speaks beyond history. It is the same reassurance given to those who face injustice today. Think of the environmental activists battling against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. They, too, stand before powerful forces. Many feel unheard, powerless against corporations and authorities that seem too vast to challenge. And yet, like Moses, they press on because they believe in something greater than themselves. Faith in I am gives them strength. Throughout Scripture, God's unchanging nature serves as an anchor for those facing overwhelming odds. In the New Testament, Jesus echoed the same words. Before Abraham was, I am. It was a direct claim to divinity, a statement that God's presence was no longer distant, but now among His people. So what does this mean for us? It means that when we face uncertainty, we are not alone. It means that our strength does not come from our own abilities, but from the presence of the eternal God. It means that no matter the odds, I am remains faithful. Moses stood before a burning bush and received his mission. Today, we stand before a world in need of truth, justice, and hope. And like Moses, we must decide, do we trust in our own limitations, or do we trust in the one who simply is? Confronting false powers. Throughout history, civilizations have created gods in their own image, gods tied to nature, war, prosperity, or the elements. The Egyptians had deities for the sun, the Nile, and fertility, each one dependent on human devotion and ritual to maintain power. These gods were limited, shaped by human myths and cultural imagination. But when Moses stood before the burning bush, he encountered something radically different. The God of Israel was not a God among many. He was not the sum of human stories or an invention of religious tradition. Instead, he declared, I am that I am, a name that needed no explanation, no justification. He simply is. This declaration shattered every perception of divinity that Moses had ever known. The gods of Egypt relied on temples, priests, and offerings. But the true God was self-existent, independent, and eternal. He did not need validation. He was the very source of all existence. And with this truth, he sent Moses to stand before Pharaoh, not in his own strength, but in the name of the one true God. This confrontation between the power of Pharaoh and the authority of I Am is still reflected in the struggles of today. Look at the protests against the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP. Activists stand against massive corporate interests, fighting to protect the land and their communities from environmental harm. To many, the power of these corporations seems overwhelming. Too big to challenge, too well connected to be stopped. But history tells us otherwise. Just as Pharaoh's empire seemed immovable, God proved that no earthly power stands above His will. The plagues of Egypt systematically dismantled the false authority of Pharaoh and the gods he claimed to serve, proving that only the Creator holds ultimate control. This is the same God who remains sovereign today. The battle between human institutions and divine justice has not changed. Whether it is Moses standing before Pharaoh or modern movements confronting injustice, the question remains, who holds true power? Is it the governments, corporations, and systems that seem to dictate the course of the world? Or is it the eternal God, the unshaken I Am, who has always been and will always be? Just as God called Moses to stand firm, He calls His people today to place their faith in His authority. When we face injustice, when the powers of this world seem unstoppable, we must remember, God is not limited by human systems. He is not bound by politics or corporate influence. He remains sovereign. So, as we witness the struggles of our time, we are reminded of this truth. No earthly power is absolute. No system is beyond challenge. No injustice will stand forever. Because in the end, only I Am remains. The strength behind the mission Moses stood before God, overwhelmed by the weight of the mission given to him. He was not a warrior, not a statesman, just a shepherd, haunted by his past failures and uncertain of his future. Who am I? He asked. That I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. God's response was not a lesson in leadership or a reassurance of Moses' abilities. Instead, He gave the only answer that mattered. Surely, I am with you. Moses' success would not come from his own strength, wisdom, or eloquence. It would come from the unshakable presence of the I Am. This same truth holds for us today, especially for those facing great opposition in the pursuit of justice. Consider the activists fighting against the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP. Like Moses, they stand against what seems like an impossible force. Corporations with vast influence, political resistance, and legal roadblocks at every turn. Many doubt whether their voices will be heard, whether their sacrifices will make a difference. But just as God called Moses to confront Pharaoh, many of these activists feel called to a higher purpose, to protect the land, advocate for justice, and challenge those in power. This battle between the powerful and the faithful is not new. When Moses stood before Pharaoh, the plagues that followed were not random acts of destruction. They were targeted judgments against the gods of Egypt. Each plague dismantled an Egyptian deity's supposed authority, proving that the I Am was sovereign over all. The Nile turned to blood, livestock perished, the sky turned dark. All signs that Egypt's gods were powerless before the one true God. Likewise, modern institutions often present themselves as untouchable, as if they hold ultimate authority over resources, people, and even the environment. But just as Pharaoh's reign crumbled under the power of God, no system, no institution, no corporation stands above divine justice. Even in their greatest moment of liberation, the Israelites struggled with doubt. Despite witnessing miracles, they still crafted a golden calf, seeking security in something tangible. We do the same today. Many put their faith in wealth, influence, or human institutions, believing they will bring security. But only the I Am is unchanging, faithful, and true. Moses' journey teaches us that our limitations do not define us. God's presence does. The same God who empowered Moses empowers those who seek righteousness today. He calls us to stand firm, even when the odds seem overwhelming. So whether it's an activist defending the land, a leader standing against corruption, or an individual facing personal challenges, the truth remains. Victory does not come from our abilities, but from the God who goes before us, Jesus and the I Am. Statement centuries after Moses stood before the burning bush, another man stood before a hostile crowd and made a declaration so powerful, so shocking, that it nearly got him killed. Jesus of Nazareth looked into the eyes of the religious leaders and spoke the words that still echo through time. Before Abraham was, I am. With this one sentence, Jesus directly linked himself to the voice from the burning bush, the eternal, self-existent God of Israel. He was not just a teacher, not just a prophet. He was the I Am in human form. The response was immediate. The crowd picked up stones to kill him. They understood exactly what he was saying. He was not claiming to be another messenger of God. He was claiming to be God. And for the Pharisees, this was blasphemy. But for those who believed, it was the greatest truth ever revealed. This moment is not just historical. It is deeply relevant to us today, because when Jesus declared I am, he wasn't just making a theological statement. He was giving us an invitation to trust, to believe, to stand firm, even when the world tells us otherwise. We live in a time when faith is often challenged. Society pressures us to conform, to compromise, to redefine truth. But Jesus' words remind us that truth is not a concept. It is a person. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Recognizing Jesus as the I Am means we are called to more than just belief. It means we are called to courage. It means standing for what is right, even when the world opposes us. It means trusting that the same God who spoke to Moses, the same God who walked among us as Jesus, is still with us today. Just as Moses stood before Pharaoh, just as Jesus stood before his accusers, we too must decide. Will we stand firm in our faith, or will we bow to the pressures of the world? The choice is ours, but the promise remains. I Am is with us, now and forever. Faith in uncertain times. We live in a world filled with uncertainty. Political tensions rise, Economies shift, natural disasters strike, and conflicts seem never-ending. It is easy to feel small in the face of so much instability, wondering where we can find solid ground. But history reminds us that uncertainty is nothing new. The Israelites, too, faced an unknown future as they stood between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. The early Christians, persecuted for their faith, had to trust in a promise they could not yet see. Time and again, God's people have been called to trust in Him when everything else seemed to fall apart. The I Am is not just a title. It is an assurance. It tells us that God is sovereign, even when the world looks chaotic. He is the author of history, not a passive observer. Nothing surprises Him. Nothing is beyond His reach, and nothing happens outside of His control. Even when events seem random, even when justice feels delayed, God is still at work, directing history toward His ultimate purpose. This truth speaks to us today, as it did in ancient times. Consider the protesters standing against the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP. They are up against corporations with vast resources, legal battles that seem never-ending, and opposition that seeks to silence them. And yet, they continue. They stand firm in their convictions, believing in something greater than immediate results. This perseverance mirrors the faith of those in Scripture who stood against oppression, even when the odds were against them. Whether it was Moses confronting Pharaoh, Daniel refusing to bow to Babylon, or the early church declaring Christ as king in a world ruled by Rome, faith has always been a force that challenges power. But here's the key difference. They did not stand alone. God was with them, just as He is with us today. He calls us not to live in fear, but in trust. Romans 8:28 reminds us, "In all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Even when we cannot see the full picture, even when life feels unstable, we can be certain of one thing: God is still in control. So, in a world that feels increasingly uncertain, we are faced with a choice. Will we let fear dictate our lives, or will we place our trust in the eternal I Am? Because no matter what happens, He remains the same, yesterday, today, and forever. The call to faith is not about having all the answers. It is about trusting in the one who does. From the moment Moses stood before the burning bush to the moment Jesus declared, "I am," God has always called His people to embrace the mystery of His nature rather than demand full understanding. He does not reveal every detail of His plan, nor does He promise that life will be without struggle. Instead, He calls us to trust, to walk in faith even when the road is unclear. This is one of the most challenging aspects of belief. We want certainty. We want guarantees. But faith means holding on, even when we cannot see the outcome. Moses had no idea how he would confront Pharaoh, just as Abraham had no idea how God would fulfill His promise of a son. And yet, both trusted in the I Am, and both witnessed the power of God move in unimaginable ways. This same call to faith extends to us today. Life is filled with uncertainties, unexpected hardships, moments of doubt, and seasons of waiting. And in those times, the I Am is our anchor. The protests against the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP, provide a modern example of this kind of perseverance. These activists do not know how their fight will end, but they continue to stand for what they believe is right. They face legal challenges, opposition from powerful forces, and the possibility that their efforts may not bring immediate change. And yet, they press forward. This echoes the faith of those in Scripture who stood against the odds, believing that truth and justice are always worth fighting for. But their strength, like ours, cannot come from human effort alone. It must come from faith in something greater. Jesus understood this struggle, which is why He reminded His followers, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." John 16:33. Faith does not mean avoiding difficulties. It means knowing that God is greater than them all. Just as Moses had to trust without seeing, just as the early disciples had to believe in the face of persecution, we are called to faith in uncertain times. When we place our trust in the I Am, we find peace, knowing that He is always working, always restoring, and always faithful to His promises. The question is, will we trust Him even when we don't see the full picture? The practical impact of I am faith in God is not just an abstract belief. It is a force that changes how we live, how we act, and how we face challenges. When God declared, I am that I am, He was not only revealing His eternal nature, but also inviting His people to trust in His unchanging character. This trust has real-world implications. It shapes the way we respond to uncertainty, the way we stand for justice, and the way we persevere when the odds seem against us. The Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP, protests offer a modern reflection of this kind of faith-driven action. Protesters, many of whom are people of deep conviction, continue to advocate for what they believe is right, protecting the land, their communities, and the environment. These individuals face overwhelming opposition, corporations with unlimited resources, legal battles, and societal pressure to step aside. But they continue because they believe their actions have meaning. In many ways, this mirrors the biblical figures who stood firm in faith, even when their cause seemed hopeless. Moses stood before Pharaoh with nothing but the word of God. David faced Goliath with just a sling. Esther risked her life to speak up for her people. And the early Christians preached Christ's name despite persecution. None of them had power by worldly standards, yet their faith made them unshakable. Jesus' words in Matthew 28:20 give us the same assurance today. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. This promise transforms how we approach life. It means that even in the face of great obstacles, we are never alone. God's presence does not mean we will never face struggles, but it does mean that we do not face them alone. Whether standing up for justice, enduring personal hardships, or navigating an uncertain world, we can move forward with confidence. The I Am is not distant. He is with us. He sustains us. And He calls us to live out our faith boldly, knowing that His presence is our greatest strength. Worshiping the true God. Throughout history, humanity has struggled with the temptation to replace God with idols. These idols may not always take the form of golden statues, as in the days of the Israelites, but they are no less dangerous. Wealth, power, human approval. These things often take precedence over faith, drawing our focus away from the eternal, on I Am. This struggle is not new. In Exodus, after God miraculously led the Israelites out of Egypt, the people still turned to a golden calf when they felt uncertain. Instead of trusting in the invisible yet ever-present God, they sought comfort in something tangible, something they could see and control. It was a fatal mistake. Modern society is no different. The idols of industry and profit have shaped much of the world we live in. Money and power often dictate decision-making more than morality and faith. The pursuit of profit frequently overshadows stewardship of God's creation, ethical responsibility, and the well-being of others. This is evident in events like the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP protests. The fight over the pipeline is more than a legal or environmental issue. It is a reflection of a broader conflict, the battle between material gain and moral responsibility. Industries prioritize financial gain, often at the expense of communities, nature, and long-term sustainability. But what does God call us to value? His word teaches that true prosperity comes not from hoarding wealth, but from walking in righteousness. Jesus challenged this directly when He said in Matthew 6:19-21, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This passage is not just about money. It's about priorities. Where do we place our trust? What do we truly worship? The MVP protests, like many social movements before them, reveal how deeply the world is invested in earthly wealth. But as Christians, we are called to something greater. We are called to worship the Creator, not creation. God's sovereignty reminds us that no amount of human power or financial success can replace Him. The I Am is above all things. He is eternal, unshakable, and sovereign over history. So the real question is, will we worship the things of this world, or will we stand firm in faith, trusting in the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever? The battle against injustice. For generations, the story of Moses and the Israelites' exodus from Egypt has stood as a powerful testament to God's deliverance from oppression. The Egyptian Pharaoh ruled with an iron grip, enslaving an entire people and forcing them into grueling labor. The Israelites had no political power, no rights, and no way out, until God stepped in. When Moses, an ordinary man called by God, stood before Pharaoh, he was not just confronting a ruler, he was challenging an entire system of power, wealth, and oppression. Pharaoh saw himself as untouchable, his kingdom as unshakable, but God's justice would not be denied. That same battle for justice is still being waged today. Throughout history, people of faith have stood up to those in power, challenging corruption, oppression, and the destruction of God's creation. We see this reflected in today's Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP, protests. Just as Moses confronted Pharaoh over the suffering of God's people, modern activists confront institutions they believe harm communities and the environment. The MVP pipeline has sparked controversy, with many arguing that it threatens land, water, and the well-being of those who live nearby. Protesters have risked arrest, lawsuits, and public criticism because they believe in something greater than human laws or corporate profit. They believe that protecting God's creation is a cause worth fighting for. But standing up against powerful institutions is never easy. Moses understood this firsthand. When he first demanded that Pharaoh release the Israelites, Pharaoh refused. In fact, he made their work even harder, increasing their suffering. The road to justice was not quick or easy, but it was inevitable. God does not ignore injustice. In Exodus 3:7, God tells Moses, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering." God's concern wasn't passive. He acted, sending plagues upon Egypt, breaking Pharaoh's will, and ultimately leading his people to freedom. It is a reminder that no system of oppression, no empire, no ruler can stand against the power of God. So what does this mean for us today? It means that when we see oppression, corruption, or the destruction of God's creation, we cannot remain silent. Just as Moses was called to speak out, to act, and to trust in God's power, we too are called to stand for truth and justice. This doesn't mean every protest or movement perfectly aligns with God's will, but it does mean that believers should ask, are we on the side of righteousness? Are we caring for God's creation? Are we speaking up for the oppressed? Ultimately, the story of Moses reminds us that God is sovereign over all things. No pharaoh, no corporation, no government is beyond his reach. And when people stand up for what is right, trusting in the power of the great I Am, they do not stand alone. They stand with the God of justice. The consequences of false security. Throughout history, humanity has sought security in things they can control: wealth, power, influence. But when those things fail, the illusion of control crumbles, leaving people feeling lost and uncertain. This was precisely the mistake the Israelites made in the wilderness. After witnessing God's miraculous power in Egypt, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the provision of manna, they still struggled to trust Him fully. When Moses ascended Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, the Israelites grew impatient. They wanted something tangible, something they could see and touch. So they crafted a golden calf and worshipped it. Their actions weren't just about impatience. They were about misplaced security. The Israelites had seen God's power. Yet, when faced with uncertainty, they turned to something man-made for reassurance. How often do we do the same? In today's world, false security comes in many forms. People place their trust in bank accounts, careers, political figures, or even social status. The problem isn't these things themselves, it's making them our foundation. When we believe our security rests in things that can disappear overnight, we build our lives on sinking sand. Consider the Mountain Valley Pipeline controversy. Many protesters believe that large industries, like the ones backing the pipeline, prioritize profit over the well-being of people and the environment. Some see corporations as modern golden calves, idols of industry and economic gain that demand sacrifice while offering no lasting security. But the truth is, neither money nor power can provide real peace. Proverbs 11:28 warns, "Those who trust in their riches will fall, but the righteous will thrive like a green leaf." The Israelites learned this lesson the hard way. When Moses returned and saw their idolatry, judgment followed. Their golden calf didn't save them. It led to disaster. The Bible consistently reminds us that only God is truly sufficient. Philippians 4:19 declares, "And my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus." This doesn't mean God gives us everything we want, but he provides what we truly need: strength, wisdom, and purpose. When we chase after false security, we run the risk of losing sight of God's eternal provision. Just as the Israelites had to be reminded that God, not gold, was their salvation, we too must evaluate where we place our trust. So what can we learn from their failure? Patience in waiting on God. The Israelites wanted immediate answers, but faith often requires trusting in God's timing. Beware of cultural idols. The golden calf wasn't just a random creation, it mirrored the false gods of Egypt. Likewise, we must be careful not to adopt the world's definition of security. God alone is enough. When we look to anything other than God for ultimate fulfillment, we will be disappointed. But when we build our lives on Him, we stand on an unshakable foundation. The story of the golden calf is a warning, but also an invitation. An invitation to trust in the one who never fails, never fades, and never abandons us. While idols crumble, God remains. The assurance of God's presence. No matter where we go, no matter what we face, the I Am is with us. This is not just a theological statement. It's a truth that has the power to transform our daily lives. Paul, in Philippians 4:12-13, speaks of a contentment that transcends circumstances. "I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength." What does this mean for us today? In a world filled with uncertainty, conflict, and rapid change, it's easy to feel anxious about the future. But the presence of God is our constant assurance, a foundation that never shifts. When we trust in the I Am, we are no longer defined by fear, doubt, or instability. Instead, we find peace in His sufficiency. This is the message of Exodus 3:14. God didn't just tell Moses His name, He revealed His unchanging nature. The same God who delivered the Israelites is the same God who walks with us today. His name, I Am, means He is everything we need in every moment. So what does this mean for you? If you are worried about the future, remember, the I Am is in control. If you feel weak or unworthy, remember, the I Am is your strength. If you feel alone, remember, the I Am is always with you. This truth is more than comforting. It's empowering. Before we end, I want to invite you to reflect on this message. How has the I Am impacted your life? Have you trusted Him as your source of strength, peace, and hope. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I read each one and pray over them. If this message has encouraged you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. The I Am is with you, now and forever. Let's continue this journey together. See you in the next video.